We now take a long look rather at the U.S. tax cuts, which were approved a year ago this month by the U.S. Congress. To help us out, we are pleased to be joined by a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Professor Richard Wolff. Professor, welcome back. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So, the economy seemed to be rolling quite well along early this year, and markets reflected a pretty positive attitude. That said, a lot of the benefits from the tax cuts went to buy dividends, buybacks, etc. And we have seen companies like General Motors recently not reinvesting in manufacturing and the like. What's your take on how these actual tax cuts have benefited the U.S. economy, Professor?
Well, unfortunately, those tax cuts were designed to be a big fat gift to corporations and the richest people amongst us. And that's pretty much how it's played out. Suddenly, businesses across America, mostly the big ones, but also the medium and small ones, had a gift, money that thought they had to pay in taxes, they wouldn't have to pay anymore, and they could do whatever else they wanted to. And it turns out, in part because the American economy is in such trouble and people don't have very much to spend, that they didn't spend the money, contrary to what Mr. Trump and the GOP promised. They didn't spend the money on hiring more workers, on producing more output. They did things like buy back stocks. They did things like distribute greater dividends to their shareholders. They did things like jacking up the already record-high payment they give to top executives. And if they hired a few more people, which they did in the first half of 2018, it was relatively modest. And on the flip side of it, put it this way, they made the rich richer and everybody not so much. And so the underlying inequality of this society, which is such a profound problem, was not only not solved, it actually got worse. And so you see now, less than a year later, that the stock market is in major gyrations. The anxiety about an imminent recession is now everywhere. So this boost that it gave was small, benefited mostly the folks at the top, and leaves us 1 year later in as bad, if not worse, a situation as we were back then.
You know, Professor, I'm so glad you mentioned inequality. You've been kind enough to speak with us about that in the past, and that's something we want to talk about all the time. It's been exacerbated. I do want to get your take on GM in particular. I mean, here's a company that needed a government bailout, got a government bailout, and some are saying, look, here, the holidays are approaching, and you're going to cut all these workers and shut down these plants in Canada and in the U.S. On the other hand, you could argue, hey, part of the problem with management and the resultant bailout was because they didn't make some tough decisions. What's your take on GM?
Well, I think we are always, in a sense, open to blackmail by corporations. General Motors, at the height of the crisis and crash in 2008, went to the government at that time and said, you better bail us out, because if you don't, we are going to collapse. And General Motors is looked upon as a symbol of American capitalism, and there will be panic around the world at what is happening if, in addition to all the other downturn catastrophe news, the biggest car company in the country falls apart. So the government basically felt it had no choice. It gave them $50 billion. Over the years that came afterwards, General Motors only paid back $40 billion. So the taxpayers of America are out a loss of $10 billion to this company. It has meanwhile resumed its profitability, paid out lots of dividends to shareholders, and all the rest. The thing that blew my mind as an economist was all of that money given to them without any conditions. In other words, you could have said, okay, we'll bail you out, even if we don't like it, but you have to commit not to cut your workforce, not to damage the communities and states that depend on you. And if you do, then we're going to get some of that money back, because that's not your responsibility. We didn't do that. So now they're saying we're cutting all these jobs, a horrific Christmas present for families and communities across the Midwest, in U.S. and Canada. And in a sense, It's our own politicians having given them a bailout without any conditions that leave them free to do this. It's a statement about a system that isn't working.
You know, every time you talk, I'm thinking of something else. It reminds me of another bailout, Professor, and we go back to right after the financial collapse when, with the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, which bailed out the banks. We did the same darn thing then. We didn't even have the guts, and when I say we, I mean Congress in this regard, didn't even have the guts to say you can't pay your executives, your CEOs, billions of dollars while you're essentially being propped up by the U.S. taxpayers. It just drives me nuts that we don't have the guts to do that sort of thing, which you would think would be not partisan at all. You would think it would be Republican Democrats would agree, right?
Yes, and there's actually one more twist to this, which may even blow your mind one step further. The money that the government gave the banks, which is in the trillions of dollars if you add up the investments, the loans, the forgiveness of obligations, part of that money was collected by the banks, who used it, in part, to pay for the lobbyists to go back to Congress to make sure that the regulations were few, were weak, etc. In other words, the banks used the bailout money to make sure they didn't have to make commitments in exchange for the bailout. It's a story of the abuse of government by big business, in this case banks, that really exceeds even what we have come to expect.
It's a circuitous and utterly gross circumstance. Let me ask you, and this is sort of a theoretical question, Professor, before we go. If you had to do it over again and you said, look, there is this $1.5 trillion, which we don't have, of course, but we're going to spend it on tax cuts. We're just going to rejigger the thing, and we're not going to go from 35 to 21. We're going to make sure the middle income folks pay less. Or you had a big infrastructure bill, help our crumbling roads, bridges, and infrastructure. What would you have preferred, or would it be none of the above?
No, I would have preferred, of course, that the tax cut be given to the people who deserved it. Let's be honest amongst ourselves. We have for 30 years had an economy becoming more and more unequal. The rich have taken the big bulk of all the gain and growth in our economy for 30 years. And the mass of people have had a harder and harder time getting by. 30 years ago, we didn't have to borrow up to here to have our kid go to college. We didn't have to load up on levels of debt for our credit card we can't sustain anymore, etc. So what we needed was help for the middle and the lower half of our country, the majority of our people. That's who should have gotten the tax cut, not the corporations who've been doing better in the last 30 years than they've ever done before. And the benefit of it would have been, if you give the tax cut to middle and lower income, these are the people, because they have to, who immediately spend it, who buy goods and services, and that would have led corporations to hire more people and to give more incomes to the people they have. It would have had much more of the effect that Trump and the GOP promised, but that never showed up because they gave the money to the folks who are already rich and are not going to be spending that much more of it. So I would have changed it dramatically that way. And I also, when the spending came, I would have been spending money where, again, the need is. We have ecological needs that are urgent for this planet. We have rebuilding the infrastructure. We have lots of important work to be done, lots of people who need a good job doing it, and that's what we should have done if we had had human beings as our priority rather than the profit of a few.
Absolutely. We can't thank you enough for taking the time to be with us, Professor. Thank you so much. Take care.
My pleasure. Thank you.